Hi, I'm Larry McRae with Poison Spyder, and you're watching Spyder U. Spyder U is an informational series dedicated to the owners of the Jeep Wrangler and its predecessor, the CJ. Now, these Jeeps are some of the most capable off-road vehicles available right from the factory, but many of us want more. Millions, if not billions, are spent every year to make our Jeeps not only more capable, but better looking. Each segment of Spyder U will be dedicated to a particular part or a series of parts, and we'll go over the features and benefits of each one to help you make educated decisions for your next upgrade, depending on the way that you plan to use your Jeep. This segment of Spyder U will be dedicated to the JK Flare. We'll talk about what you get from the factory and how it may not work for you if you've modified your Jeep. We'll talk about how you may modify this thing to make it work for you, or some of the aftermarket options that are available for you, and help you make an educated decision on what's right for the way you use your Jeep. From the factory, your Jeep JK came with a plastic flare. This plastic flare serves a couple of functions. One, it's a mud flap, and it also holds your side marker light. As you can see, it comes with a pretty good factory wheel opening, but when you put this flare on there, you lose several inches either in up travel or at the back of the wheel opening. So for many of us, this factory flare may be all you ever need, but if you've actually used your Jeep off-road or you've went with an aftermarket wheel and tire combo, you may have noticed there's some shortcomings that come along with this factory flare. One is how it's attached. It's attached with plastic clips. So if you encounter a trail obstacle, it will flex a little bit, but eventually it's strong enough where it's going to want to try and rip this thing off your Jeep fender. And as you can see, the factory sheet metal is not that rigid and will probably cause damage as it's coming off. Or you may have encountered some contact with your new tires, either while turning or in compression. Again, it tries to rip it off your Jeep. You have a couple options with this factory flare. One is to remove it altogether, and you've got this nice big wheel opening, and you don't have to worry about your tires ever rubbing this flare. You do lose the mud flap feature, and you lose your side marker light, which probably is going to be an issue if you plan on driving this on the street. Another option is to actually just trim this factory flare. In doing so, again, you'll lose your side marker light, but you still have some of the mud flap value. This does kind of weaken the structure. There is a structural part behind this, and these bends in the factory flare actually add some strength. So if you trim them, you may notice that they'll sag a little bit when it gets hot, or maybe even flap in the wind. So the aftermarket has come up with many solutions, and that'll be the next segment we go over. There are two categories of aftermarket flares available for your Jeep JK. We'll break them down into the two categories, which we call the non-armor, which is what I'm holding here, and the armored version of the JK flare. The non-armor is anything made of plastic, fiberglass, or even carbon fiber. The purpose of these are to increase the wheel opening, which is the number one cause of damage to these factory flares. And many of them include the side marker light, but also to give you some choices on width. So if you have tire coverage issues, many of these may be an inexpensive way for you to get the tire coverage you need. These also range from very inexpensive to even more expensive than the highest priced armored flares. So be very selective when you're looking at your aftermarket flare choices. The pros of these aftermarket flares is it does, again, increase your wheel opening. Many of them have the side marker light. They're very inexpensive, some of them, and they're pretty lightweight. The cons are they don't act as armor, and you have some of the same issues you have with your plastic flares. When these come in contact with trail obstacles, you may find that they flex a little bit, but many of them will transfer that load, again, back to this factory sheet metal, which was never designed to take that kind of impact. And they're attached very similarly to the factory flares, some with plastic clips, some of them with actual nut certs, which are a little bit better, except that when they come in contact with a trail obstacle, they have a tendency to want to pull the sheet metal away and sometimes actually cause more damage than the factory flare might because of that nut cert installation. The factory flares, when trimmed, have an issue with the flares sagging. Some of the soft plastic flares have that same issue. The hard plastic flares won't have the issue with sagging, but they do have some brittle issues that or some issues that will transfer that load quicker to your sheet metal, but also they have a tendency to crack when they impact a trail obstacle. So if a hard plastic, fiberglass, or carbon fiber flare hits a rock, typically it's junk. A plastic flare that's pliable when it hits a rock may absorb some of that impact. It may gouge a little bit, but it may not necessarily ruin it. If the impact is hard enough, again, it may ruin this flare and also cause damage to your sheet metal. So that's the non-armor version of the JK flare. The next category of flare I'd like to cover is the armored flare. Our definition of the armored flare is any flare that when it comes in contact with a trail obstacle or your tires won't cause more damage to your factory sheet metal than what the factory flare does. Generally speaking, that means a metal flare, but not all metal flares are considered armor, and let me explain to you why. Any flare, no matter how strong the flare is, that attaches strictly to this very thin factory sheet metal should not fall into the category as armor. As a matter of fact, some of the stronger flares on the market that rely solely on this sheet metal for attachment may actually cause more damage to your Jeep than some of the more pliable or even the factory flare. Let me show you what to look for when you're shopping for an armored flare for your Jeep JK. So behind that very thin outer sheet metal is a very substantial substructure. The tub itself is made of much thicker gauge steel. Then there's an area here where there's a couple pieces laminated together with actually a 90-degree bend. So there's a lot of strength right here, and we designed a bracket to take advantage of that strength. There's also this rectangular subframe and a very structural bracket on that subframe. And we've taken advantage of all this strength with our subframe brackets that attach to our flare. Let me show you on the other side how we've taken advantage of that strength. So on the other side of the Jeep, we're able to peel back the layers physically to show that there is actually a substantial structure back there to attach our flare to. We do that virtually first, and what I mean by that is we get a 3D model from Jeep, and we're able to peel back those layers in our CAD program until we find a substantial structure to attach our flare to. So now that we know we have substantial structure, how do we take advantage of it? How do we transfer those impact loads from the trail to that structural part of the tub? Well, it all starts with this tube. This tube or rub rail is 1 3/4 120 wall DOM tubing. And DOM tubing is much more dent resistant than a welded seam tubing, which many of the flares out there today are built with that welded seam tubing. This tubing is actually welded to a 1/8 inch top plate. That top plate is designed to not only help follow the contours of the Jeep, but it also transfers some of the load from this tube back to this attachment bracket or plate. As you can see, this plate has a little curve to it. That curve is designed to follow the curve of your JK tub. All these in concert transfer that load evenly throughout the entire wheel opening. But most importantly, you'll see there's a couple of gussets here. These gussets all correspond with a bracket. This bracket is actually attached to the structural part of the tub that I showed you earlier. This one in particular attaches to the pinch seam. So that's through bolted to the pinch seam, through bolted to the attachment plate, which transfers a load to this gusset, which goes back to this tube. This bracket bolts up underneath that subframe, and then your flare actually attaches to this bracket. So it actually passes through the factory outer sheet metal and is actually bolted to the subframe through this bracket. You'll also notice that on this gusset, there's 2 holes on here, and these holes correspond with that tab that came off the factory subframe. So you have 2 more opportunities to bolt your flare to that subframe, 2 more opportunities to transfer that load from the trail back to the subframe and not onto your factory sheet metal. We start with a structural crusher flare, of course, and then we attach it to the structural part of your tub. The first thing you'll see is that there's a couple of bolts here through this subframe tab into one of our gussets. You'll also notice a subframe bracket here, which is bolted to the plate on our crusher flare and ultimately would be bolted into your subframe. In this case, it's just bolted here or laying here for mock-up. You can also see the pinch seam bracket, which is through bolted again to the crusher flare plate and then through bolted again to the pinch seam. All this again transfers any impact loads or any pull loads into the structural part of your tub. While we're down here, there's a couple other features I'd like to point out. One, you'll notice that all the hardware, the mounting hardware, is countersunk. It gives it a nice clean look. You'll notice that on some of the painted ones that it's a very beautiful look. Also, we've made the wheel opening much larger, but that also creates another problem. What do you do with your inner fender liner? Well, in this case, you can trim it for the larger wheel opening and to fit the flare, but we've provided these 3 tabs, and what that allows you to do is pull that pliable liner back to the new larger wheel opening. These are slotted, so if you've trimmed sheet metal and you want to make your opening a little bit bigger, you can slide them in or out to accommodate the larger wheel opening. You'll also notice that we've made accommodations for an LED side marker light. When you remove your factory flare, of course, you remove that side marker light. So this allows you to replace that with a LED side marker light. If you're looking for an armored flare for the rear of your Jeep, be sure you look for the same features we just talked about for the armored flare for the front of your Jeep. Let me show you what we've done to take advantage of some of the structural points at the rear of the tub of your Jeep JK. So for our rear crusher flares, we've designed two brackets very similar to the brackets we designed for the front crusher flares. We've got a pinch seam bracket very similar to the front pinch seam bracket that allows you to through bolt your flare to the most structural part of this tub. You'll also notice that Jeep has incorporated a gusset here. That gusset supports the load of the roll cage. So we designed a bracket specifically to fit between the rear corner panel and the inner tub and attached to that cage support. So we've got three surfaces this bracket bolts to and also through bolts through your cage. So again, any load from that transferred from that flare to your tub is spread out over three surfaces and the most structural part of the rear of your Jeep. So be sure that you look for bracketry similar to this if you want an armored flare for the rear of your Jeep. We've discussed the differences between just a metal mud flap and a piece of armor. But what makes a piece of armor a piece of art? There's a lot of little design features to consider when you're trying to decide what looks best on your Jeep. Let's go over a few of those now. The JK crusher flare is very different than its predecessor, the TJ tube fender. The TJ tube fender is also called the flat fender, and it takes its name from the original Jeep that had flat fenders. Those lines work very well on the CJ, the YJ, and the TJ that all had very flat lines. Well, the JK now has curved lines. That same flat fender design doesn't translate well onto this Jeep. A lot of the aftermarket choices have taken that flat fender theme very literally, and you'll see that not only they have a sharp bend here, but that flat line doesn't fit well with the gap. As you can see on ours, the gap is equal all the way around. So we've taken the time to make sure it follows that radius. A lot of manufacturers have just used the bender die they had, and we took the time to find a bender die that fit the radius of the Jeep. So we don't have that sharp angle here. It's a nice flowing angle, fits perfectly with the line of the tub. Part of the design of this particular flare is to have the tube taper back in the tub gradually as opposed to coming down at a 90 into the tub. This look is not only a better look, but actually functions better, and let me show you how. See how this front edge tapers into the front of the Jeep as opposed to coming out straight and then 90 into the Jeep? That's a pretty common design. But imagine you've encountered a trail obstacle like a tree here. So if you've got that 90-degree edge up against that tree, it may impede forward progress. With this tapered edge, the Jeep may actually push around it or scoot around that tree as opposed to getting hung up on that tree. You'll also notice that there's a slight taper on the edge of our top plate. This plate on tube design goes all the way back to the CJ, but we're one of the few that actually take the time to feather that edge. It's not too noticeable here, but on the finished product, it's a very subtle and nice little design feature. One of the biggest decisions you'll have to make when choosing an armored flare is what material is right for you. Is it going to be aluminum or is it going to be steel? And a lot of that will depend on not only how you use your Jeep, but where you use your Jeep. Let me go over some of the features and benefits of each one of these materials so you can decide what's best for you. In the area of weight, aluminum is the clear winner. In the area of strength, steel is the clear winner. When you're talking about rust, aluminum is the clear winner. So if you're living in an area where they salt the roads or you're near the coast, aluminum might be the right choice for you. If you're in the arid Southwest and you might encounter a lot of rocks, then steel's probably the best for you. If weight is a big issue, that 50 pounds difference between the aluminum set and a steel set may seem very insignificant the first time you encounter a rock. The aluminum is much more likely to dent, to bend, and to gouge than the steel. So the decision on which is best for you all comes down to, again, how you use your Jeep and where you use your Jeep, and only you can decide which is best for your particular use. So whether you decided to use an armored flare or a non-armored flare, the next decision you'll have to make is how wide a flare works best for you. If the factory width flare worked okay for you, then our standard width flare might work okay for you also. This is 9 inches wide, which is about the same width as a factory flare. If you're a guy like me that would rather have your tire encounter the trail obstacle and not necessarily your flare, this narrow flare or the 6-inch wide flare might be the right choice for you. If you're in an area where tire coverage is critical, this 11-inch wide flare might be the right choice for you. We've also added a little material to the back to help satisfy the tire coverage laws. So the determining factors in which width is right for you are, again, how you use your Jeep and where you use your Jeep. I hope this segment has answered a lot of the questions you may have had on what JK flares are right for you. A lot of this technical data will be available on our webpage, but if you have a specific question I haven't answered, please feel free to call our sales staff. They love to talk Jeeps, and thanks again for watching Spyder U.